I was supposed to be a ghostwriter, not a ghost. My words were meant to speak through other people, never from my own mouth. That was the deal when I signed with Bad Boy Records in the fall of 1996. My creativity in exchange for a paycheck and proximity to power. I never imagined I'd be ghostwriting for a literal ghost, or that the same hands that built a hip-hop empire were building something much darker in the shadows. They tell you to speak your truth. Mine is this. I believe Sean Combs had Biggie Smalls killed. And I believe something of Biggie never left that studio. Something that still whispers in the tracks we laid down in those final months. What I'm about to share with you isn't just industry gossip or another conspiracy theory. It's a pattern of behavior I witnessed. A series of calculated moves that stopped feeling like business and started feeling like something much more sinister. This isn't about East Coast versus West Coast. This is about what happens when ambition becomes a hunger that can only be fed by destruction. My entry into Bad Boy Records came through a demo tape I'd made in my cousin's basement in Queens. I had a knack for capturing Biggie's flow, the easy cadence, the streetwise storytelling mixed with unexpected vulnerability. When I got the call to come to the Hit Factory studio on West 54th Street, I thought I'd won the lottery. The first time I walked into the Bad Boy offices, the energy was electric in the purest sense of the word. Gold and platinum records covered the walls. Craig Mack's Flava in Ya Ear, Biggie's Ready to Die, the early signs of an empire being built. The place smelled of expensive cologne, cigar smoke, and ambition. I was a 22-year-old kid from a neighborhood where dreams usually went to die, and suddenly I was being ushered into the inner sanctum. I met Biggie exactly once, before my role became more complicated. He was larger than life in every sense, physically imposing but with a smile that felt genuinely warm. He clapped me on the shoulder, called me youngin', and told me he'd heard my tape. "You got the flow," he'd said, his voice that familiar rumble. "Just remember, keep it real, even when you're making it up." Those words would haunt me later. My official title was creative assistant, but my real job was to craft verses for bad boy artists when they were too busy, too tired, or too distracted to write for themselves. It was common practice, though never acknowledged publicly. The music industry runs on ghosts, people like me who create the art that others take credit for. At first, I was just happy to be there, to hear my words come out of famous mouths. But gradually I began to notice the cracks in the glittering facade. The first disturbance happened subtly. I was working late in Studio 4, piecing together a verse for a track that would eventually appear on Mace's debut album. The studio was empty except for me, or so I thought. Around 2 a.m. I kept hearing a faint whispering through my headphones, like someone had left a microphone open in another room. When I took the headphones off, the room was silent. But when I put them back on, there it was again, a rhythmic mumbling, almost like someone working through a verse. I assumed it was bleed from another session and thought nothing of it until the next day, when one of the engineers mentioned they'd been having weird electrical shit happening in that studio. Tape decks rolling by themselves, mics picking up static when they're supposed to be dead, he'd said, shaking his head. Places getting haunted. We'd both laughed it off. This was New York City in the 90s, old buildings, older wiring. What did we expect? The incidents started stacking up, each one small enough to explain away, but together forming something more concerning. It began with Combs' behavior in the weeks following Tupac's death in September 1996. While the hip-hop world reeled from the loss, I noticed something peculiar about our boss. He seemed almost energized by the tragedy. I'll never forget the emergency meeting he called the day after Tupac died. We gathered in the conference room, producers, assistants, a few artists. The mood was somber, uncertain. Combs walked in, dressed entirely in white, and didn't offer a single word of condolence. Instead, he laid out a new marketing strategy centered around what he called the legacy angle. "Death cells," he said, pacing before us. "But martyrdom? That's forever. We need to position Biggie as the surviving king of hip-hop." He turned to me specifically. "I want you to start working on material for life after death. Themes of mortality, legacy, what comes next." The album title had been chosen months before, but now it felt eerily prophetic. The following week saw a shift in Combs's demands. He became obsessed with posthumous releases, often asking me to study the sales numbers of artists like Selena and Kurt Cobain, who had seen their popularity skyrocket after death. "There's a window," he told me once, late at night when he thought everyone else had gone home. "A moment when an artist becomes more valuable as a memory than as a person." The most chilling premonition came from Biggie himself. In January 1997, he came into the studio to lay down vocals for what would become "You're Nobody Till Somebody Kills You." The track was dark even by Biggie's standards, a meditation on fame and mortality that felt uncomfortably prescient. During a break, he pulled me aside, his usual jovial manner replaced with a seriousness I'd never seen before. "Young'un," he said, his voice low, "you notice how Puff been acting different since Pac died?" I nodded cautiously. Biggie looked toward the control room where Combs was on the phone, gesturing animatedly. "He keeps talking about legacy, about making history." I told him, "I ain't trying to be history yet." He gave a humorless laugh. "But he's got that look in his eye, that hungry look." 2 weeks before his death, something strange happened with Biggie's security detail. I was arriving at the studio just as Biggie was leaving. I noticed Combs's head of security applying a distinctive parking permit to Biggie's SUV, a bright green sticker with a specific symbol. What struck me as odd was that the same sticker wasn't on Combs's vehicle parked right beside it. When I mentioned it to one of the other assistants, they shrugged it off. "Probably just forgot to put it on Puff's car," they said. But later, I'd learned from Combs' former bodyguard Gene Deal that someone in their crew had specifically marked Biggie's vehicle that night. The day Biggie left for Los Angeles in March 1997, I was tasked with organizing his lyric notebooks for the trip. Combs came into the office I shared with 2 other assistants and took the notebooks himself. Unusual, since that was typically a job for junior staff. He lingered in the doorway for a moment, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Biggie's going to make history out there," he said. It wasn't a prediction, it sounded like a promise. I wasn't in Los Angeles on March 9, 1997. I was back in New York, working late at the Hit Factory on post-production for what we all knew would be Biggie's masterpiece. When the call came through about the shooting, the studio went silent in a way I've never experienced since. Not just quiet, but hollow. What stays with me most isn't the shock or the grief, but Combs's reaction when he returned to New York. He gathered the entire Bad Boy staff in the main conference room. He was dressed impeccably as always, but his eyes were clear and focused, not red-rimmed like the rest of ours. He didn't cry. He didn't seem shaken. Instead, he laid out the plan for the album's release. "Life After Death comes out in 2 weeks," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to make this the biggest album in hip-hop history. For Biggie." The phrase "for Biggie" would become a mantra in the coming months, attached to every business decision, every marketing strategy. But in that moment, all I could think about was something Biggie had said to me during that January recording session. We'd been working on a verse for My Downfall, where he rapped about paranoia and betrayal. He'd stopped mid-take and looked at me through the glass. "You hear that, young'un?" he'd said. "That's the sound of prophecy." At the time, I thought he was being poetic. Now it felt like a warning. The true horror began after the funeral. We had months of work ahead, mixing, mastering, preparing the album for release. Combs insisted we use as much of Biggie's material as possible, including tracks that were barely finished. I was assigned to Studio 3, where Biggie had done most of his vocal work, to compile and clean up his performances. The first time I heard it, I thought I was imagining things. I was working on the second verse of Long Kiss Goodnight, a track brimming with barely concealed anger. I had isolated Biggie's vocal track and was listening through high-quality studio headphones when I heard it. A second voice, faint but unmistakable, layered underneath his. It wasn't singing. It wasn't even rapping. It was whispering, the same rhythmic mumbling I'd heard months before in Studio 4. But this time I could make out words. It wasn't the coast. It was the cost. I tore the headphones off, my heart hammering. Audio pareidolia, I told myself. The brain's tendency to find patterns in random noise. I took a break, got some coffee, and returned to work with fresh ears. But it happened again on You're Nobody, till somebody kills you. This time the whisper was clearer. Look at the money. Follow the money. The breaking point came when I was working on Notorious Thugs. I had Biggie's vocal track isolated, and during a pause between verses, the whisper returned, louder and more urgent than before. He knew they were coming. I was so startled I knocked over my coffee, sending brown liquid spreading across the mixing board. I fumbled with the controls, my hands shaking. That's when I noticed something else unusual. The track had a faint echo that shouldn't have been there according to the studio logs. When I checked the metadata, it showed the vocal had been recorded in Studio 3 on January 15, 1997. But I had been in Studio 3 that entire day, and Biggie hadn't been there. The vocal had been added later. I went to Combs with what I'd found, framing it as a technical issue that needed resolving. He listened patiently as I explained about the anomalous vocal track, the whispering that shouldn't be there. When I finished, he didn't seem surprised. Instead, he smiled, a thin, knowing expression that chilled me to my core. "You're hearing things, kid," he said, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. "Grief does funny things to the mind. But the metadata," I started, "can be glitchy," he finished for me. "We've been working the equipment hard. Everyone's tired." He stood up and came around the desk, putting a hand on my shoulder. The gesture might have seemed fatherly if not for the pressure of his grip, just a little too tight. "Why don't you take some time off? You've been working too hard?" I started to protest, but he cut me off. "The album is going to be huge," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Bigger than anyone imagined. Sometimes tragedy is just business waiting to happen." That's when I saw it, the flicker in his eyes. Not grief, not sadness, but calculation. And in that moment I knew. I knew that the whispers in the tracks weren't paranormal. They were the last desperate warnings of a man who sensed what was coming. I knew that Biggie's death hadn't been just another casualty of the hip-hop wars. It had been a business decision. The most terrifying thing wasn't that Biggie was speaking from beyond the grave, it was that he might have been trying to warn us from before he even died. Left Bad Boy Records in May 1997, shortly after Life After Death was released. The official reason was creative differences, but the truth was I couldn't sleep anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whispering. Every time I saw Combs on television talking about carrying on Biggie's legacy, I felt physically ill. The album became a monumental success, exactly as Combs had predicted. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts, eventually selling over 10 million copies. Biggie had indeed become more valuable as a memory than as a living artist. I tried to leave the music business entirely, but the industry has long tentacles. Word got around that I was difficult or unstable. Job offers dried up. I eventually moved to the West Coast and found work scoring independent films. Quiet, anonymous work that paid the bills but never threatened to make me famous. For years I told myself I was crazy, That I had imagined the whispers, misinterpreted Combs' ambition for something darker. But then the stories started emerging. The lawsuits, the allegations, the patterns of behavior that stretched back decades. The video of Combs attacking Cassie Ventura. The testimonies from staff about the freak-offs and the demanding volatile behavior. The numerous allegations of assault and misconduct. Most chillingly, the court documents from Keefe D's trial, where Combs' name appears 77 times in connection with Tupac's murder. The theory that Combs had put a bounty on Tupac's head. The same pattern of using violence as a business strategy. The pattern repeats. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Watching the recent allegations against Combs unfold has felt like watching a horror movie I've already seen. The same tactics, the same manipulation, the same hunger for power and control, just with different victims. When I heard about the federal raids on Combs' properties, where police found more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and drugs, I wasn't surprised. I'd seen the preparations for those wild king nights firsthand. When I read staff accounts of being asked to procure lubricants and clean up after parties, I remembered the hushed conversations in bad boy hallways. The horror isn't that one man might be a monster. It's that the entire entertainment industry is structured to enable such monsters. We create systems where talent is commodified, where people become assets, and where those assets sometimes become more valuable when they're destroyed than when they're alive. I still work with audio, though I'm careful about what projects I take. Sometimes when I'm working on a particularly complex mix, I'll still hear it, that faint whispering at the edge of hearing. I've learned to live with it, the way some people learn to live with chronic pain. The truth about what happened to Biggie Smalls may never be officially confirmed. But if you listen closely to Life After Death, not to the music but to the spaces between the music, you might hear it too. The ghost isn't in the machine. It's in the metadata. It's in the patterns of behavior that continue to repeat. It's in the way we consume art without questioning the cost of its creation. I wasn't there the night Biggie died. I didn't see the shooter or the dark Chevrolet Impala, but I was there in the days and weeks leading up to it. I saw the business calculations being made. I heard the whispers before they became screams. The greatest psychological horror isn't something that goes bump in the night. It's the quiet realization that the people who create the soundtracks to our lives might be composing elegies for their own artists. It's understanding that sometimes the most successful careers are built on graves. So the next time you listen to Mo Money Mo Problems or Hypnotize, pay attention during the quiet moments. Listen carefully to the spaces between the beats. You might not hear the whispers I heard, but you'll know they're there. And once you know, you can never unknow it. That's the real horror. The truth doesn't set you free. It haunts you,